The monster, if you recall, was stitched together out of the body parts of various different corpses that Frankenstein discovered. And in this way, we could almost begin to think of the narrative structure of Frankenstein itself as the monster, because it's stitched together out of a whole bunch of other works of literature. Um, on the one hand, this is an epistolary novel. Um, the whole thing is a series of letters that Robert Walton writes to his sister Margaret. And as well, there are a number of letters that Frankenstein receives from members of his family, like Elizabeth and his father and so on, that come into the narrative. But it's a very strange version of an epistolary novel, in the sense that an epistolary novel introduces the theme of communication just by definition. You write letters and you get letters back, and they're personal usually, and they're intimate. And we never see Margaret's letters back to her brother. So it's all one directional in this, implying communication between brother and sister, but not necessarily fulfilling it. And instead introducing letters from other sources that are not to Walton, but that Walton includes because he includes the narratives of Frankenstein and the monster. So we get letters not from Walton and not to Walton, included in the text, as well as Walton's letters, but not those in response to those letters. So we never hear what his sister is really talking about. So yes, it's an epistolary novel, but it's an odd, interrupted, fragmented kind of epistolary novel, and it fragments the idea of communication and intimacy. The narrative structure is most obviously a series of nested narratives. It is one of the great classic novels of that sort, where so-and-so tells a story that is told to him by another person, which is also the story told by to that person by somebody else, and so on and so forth. Walton is talking about his own journey to the North Pole to his sister, but then he meets Frankenstein, who tells him his story, and so Walton includes Frankenstein's story within his letters. And in the letters from Elizabeth and Frankenstein's father, Alphonse, we hear their stories of what's going on back home. Which are told to Frankenstein, which are in turn told by Walton, reported back by Walton. And then Walton meets the monster, and the monster, or Frankenstein rather, meets the monster, and the monster tells him the story of his growth from the time that he was born, as it were. And then at the end, Walton meets the monster and hears more stories from the monster. So what, you might say, but the thing about having a report of a report of a report of a report is that you lose track of who's saying what. There's a kind of confusion of sources, of what voice this story is coming out of. Henry James, writing several generations after Mary Shelley, at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, when he spoke of 19th century novels by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and other sort of major writers of the 19th century, characterized the novel as large, loose, baggy monsters. That's what he said the novel was. Unlike poetry, unlike romances or short stories or well-formed literary forms, for James, a novel by definition is a monster. It lacks coherence and wholeness in this way. But as with everything in Frankenstein, Mary Shelley sets up that idea of the text as monstrous and then overturns it. We remember that Frankenstein told his story to Walton, and Walton started writing it down. Walton tells us, Frankenstein discovered that I made notes concerning his history. He himself corrected and augmented them in many places, but principally in giving the life and spirit to the conversations he held with his enemy. Since you have preserved my narration, said he, I would not that a mutilated one should go down to posterity. So in other words, Frankenstein edits his story as told by Walton so that it will be well formed and not mutilated. As if, in other words, in works of art, you have the possibility of creating perfect wholes, non-monsters if you try. And in the introduction, we remember that Mary Shelley, and this is the introduction to the 1831 edition, says, I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper. And her hideous progeny is Frankenstein, this novel. She wishes it well, go off into the world and prosper, and she calls it a hideous progeny, hideous in the sense that it's a scary story, but progeny, it's her offspring, her creation in that way, and she is well-intentioned toward it, as opposed to Frankenstein, whose hideous progeny he does not wish to go forth and prosper.